Does the ATF currently have a digital searchable registry of all firearms transactions and their owners' information that has almost 1 billion files in it? In my opinion, actually, yes. Hey guys, how's it going? I don't know about you, but lately, literally nothing would surprise me when it comes to the federal government, and more specifically, the ATF. But what I'm about to report to you is actually shocking and quite disturbing in my opinion. Let me know what you guys think down there in the comments. So this information comes to us from a letter that was provided by Congressman Michael Cloud, United States House of Representatives, and it was given to me via the GOA. So shout out to both of them for keeping on this topic, and I suggest all of you get a hold of Representative Cloud's office and let him know that you appreciate him looking out for the American people and exposing a lot of information that's startling. So let's cut right to the chase. In this letter, and I'm going to include this at the end of the video so you guys can read it yourself, from the United States Department of Justice, from an assistant director, and this is in response to some previous inquiries that Congressman Cloud and 51 of his colleagues had written. They're literally saying that in total, the ATF, otherwise known as the AFT nowadays, manages 920,664,000 out of business records as of November 2021, which means they have almost 1 billion records that pertain to things like firearms transaction records and other things that have a lot of your information on them. And I'm going to explain and I'm going to try to walk through all of this. Now, it actually gets a little worse than that. This includes digital and an estimated number of hard copy records that are awaiting conversion. It is currently estimated that 865 million plus of those records are in digitalized format. So let's back up here, and I'm going to go through several supporting articles and documents to tell you guys what's going on. But there's literally almost 1 billion records that are in digital format held by the ATF right now, and this is just the out of business records. So, real briefly, when a gun shop does any type of firearms transaction, there's paperwork or forms involved. Now, historically, these were paper. In many cases, they're digital. And I'm holding up here what's known as the Form 4473. It's known as a firearms transaction record. And I would note, this is the revision from May 2020, and I did a video on my channel then showing you how they're now moving all of the information for the gun itself right on the top, which in my opinion and many others makes it much easier to capture this information in many ways. I would also note, in addition to all of the information on the firearm, it also has all of your very personal and identifiable information here, including your name, address, place of birth, social security number if you were to provide it, your height, your weight, your sex, if you choose to identify one, because they do actually now have the non-binary option in section 14 there. Your birth date, your race, questions that normally wouldn't even be allowed to be asked for many things, but these are required for you to get permission through an FFL to get the background check, purchase the firearm. Now, I would note, in some states you wouldn't be using this for private transactions, but in other states you do, because even private party sales have to go through an FFL and then would require this form to be used. So what happens? Well, if you go to a gun shop that still uses the paper forms, and I prefer that if I'm going to do one of these, they are required to keep them on site. Your local FFL will. Now, what if they go out of business or just can't physically store them anymore? Well, that's where their facility in Virginia comes into play, where they're actually going to store, the ATF stores all of these out of business records. And it's actually required by federal law that when an FFL goes out of business, they must physically give, it could be as little as a small stack, but most likely boxes and boxes of these forms and other required types of documents to the ATF, where they would then store them. Well, there was a problem with that. See, the ATF had so many of these pieces of paper stored at one time, they actually had a floor on one of their buildings collapse. Well, they wanted to digitize it, and they'd love to have a registry of this, and this is what I'm getting at here. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments if you think they have one right now, especially after you continue to watch this video. It's a little bit concerning. So they said, well, look, we can't keep all these pieces of paper. It's just too much paper because Americans buy too many guns for us to just store all this physical paper, right? Okay, so they started transferring them over to microfilm, which was still kind of an analog way of doing things, because they would store spools of film in these big filing cabinets, and they would number the filing cabinets, and they had to know the specifics of the firearm before they could go in and access these records. Now, the only legitimate reason they purport, and this is addressed here in this letter, it's also been addressed in different congressional mandates, because remember, it's illegal for the ATF to keep a registry of these firearm transaction records. It's all to do with a criminal tracing system. So if there's a gun used in a crime, they can go back and look through what they call the ATF National Tracing Center, the NTC, and this is done for state and local law enforcement agencies across the country pursuant to active law enforcement investigations. And it says the NTC only traces crime guns, and every trace must be identified as such by the requester by selecting an appropriate crime code when submitting the trace request. So what they're trying to say is, and you guys can look at this at the end of the video, the ATF saying they're all on the up and up. They're only using this to trace crimes. Like Reagan said, yeah, they're just trying to help us, right? And that's some of the scariest words an American can hear is, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And they're saying it's for our safety. And part of the request that they were responding to does list all of the traces received, the out-of-business records trace count, and the out-of-business record violent crimes trace count. I would note, although these numbers may look big, the numbers of violent crimes they traced, those are in the tens of thousands, where the overall records they manage are getting up close to 1 billion. So you can use the ratio, and you decide if those who would, give up an essential liberty to purchase a little bit of security, do you deserve either? Well, that's what they're weighing out here. They're saying this is for your safety, okay? So there's all these 4473s and other forms, and have you guys thought about this? This probably means, even though there are other records that are kept besides just 4473s, there's probably actually, in my opinion, 1 billion guns in the United States right now. Because although some of these might be duplicates if the same firearm was transferred multiple times, there's certainly a lot of privately made firearms that would never go through a 4473, and certainly those exist because people have been making firearms in this country for private use without having an FFL since before the country actually was founded, right? And one more thing concerning that, and this is something I want you guys to look at too. This was part of the inquiry by Congressman Cloud, 51 of his colleagues. At the very end, after all this, it says, with regard to the proposed rule ATF-2021R-05, that was the proposed rule that's still ongoing right now. We're going to get results here in the spring. That has to do with privately made firearms, okay, where they want to reclassify that. They responded back and said, ATF is confident that it did not violate any laws. Additionally, be assured that the ATF always conducts a rigorous review to address issues raised through the public comment process. So that's basically all the ATF had to say about that. Don't worry, we're following the law. We're going to read the comments, which they are required to do, I would note, by federal law. So here's the deal. Why would we be worried right now, and why was Congressman Cloud worried that because they have all of these records, which we're going to find out in a minute was way more than what most people could possibly have imagined, why would that be a database, prospectively, even though they're not legally allowed to have one? And some of this actually starts to get explained in some previous things that I'm going to talk about right now, and I'm going to leave links to these articles. I have a whole bunch of sources here down there in the description for you to read and check up on if you're interested in doing so. Okay, so let's go back to December of 2020, and this is an article written by John Crump, and this was published on AmmoLand. And this is talking about how Walmart, one of the largest retailers of firearms in the United States, had about 500 stores that have discontinued the sale of firearms. So with that said, they would have a couple options. They would either have to transfer all of their out of business records, which again includes this and other types of records, straight to the ATF in West Virginia for storage, or they could actually transfer those over to a successor, which is another dealer. So they could basically take forms from stores that stopped selling firearms and transfer them to another store that is still selling firearms, which to me would have been plausible, because as of January, and this is 2020, there was 2,388 Walmart stores that sell guns. 500 stopped selling guns. But no, instead of transferring those directly to, other stores, they said, no, we'll just ship them straight to the ATF. So that's a lot of records. All of the purchase forms from 500 Walmarts, considering how much volume of sales that they do with firearms. So it goes through and says, instead, Walmart is going to hand them right over to the ATF. Internal ATF communications, this is from Crump's article, appear to show the massive retailer's internal compliance manager is working with the ATF to transfer the records to the federal agency. The ATF will then scan all received documents into a searchable database. And this is where we're going to get into this. This is how they're scanning them. In recent years, the ATF has started using high-speed scanners to catalog out-of-business FFL's records into a searchable database using optical character recognition software, otherwise known as OCR. There's different ways you can scan to image, guys. They could scan it as a bitmap, a JPEG, and those would just be pictures that would kind of in a modern day sense serve as microfilm, where the agent or whoever's working for the ATF that's trying to do one of these tracings for guns involved in a crime, although we can see there's very few of those compared to how many records they have, but I digress. They'd have to just scroll through all of them, kind of like the old roll of microfilm, and maybe not too much different than just flipping through sheets of paper. But no, as reported by Crump, they're using OCR, which by definition scans documents in a way that you can search for certain keywords, certain terms. Now, in my opinion, the ATF's using a lot of semantics here when they responded to Representative Cloud saying, nope, we're following all the laws, nothing to see here. A registry of gun owners and information versus a database, which they're not allowed to have, versus searchable scanned documents. Well, they'll figure out how to twist the words and say there's a big difference in all these. I can't figure out the difference. Can you guys? So, Crump notes, federal law prohibits the creation of a national gun registry, yet this appears to be what is happening, not only with Walmart's records, but all other out-of-business FFL records that are turned over at the close of business. It goes on to say, 18 U.S.C. Section 926A3 states that no rule or regulation prescribed after the date of the enactment of the Firearms Owners Protection Act may require that records required to be maintained under this chapter or any portion of the contents of such records be recorded at or transferred to a facility owned, managed, or controlled by the United States or any state or political subdivision thereof, nor that any system of registration of firearms, firearms owners, or firearms transactions or dispositions be established. So this was the law enacted by Congress, signed by the President Reagan at that time. Now it does go on to say, as far as following the law, the ATF is permitted by statute to collect out-of-business records from FFLs under 18 U.S.C. Section 923 G4. And then it cites it there, links down in the description, guys. For many years, FFLs would ship out their business record to the ATF's out-of-business record center in Martinsburg, West Virginia. The record sat undisturbed unless there was something specific ATF needed to go looking for, such as tracing a firearm. AmmoLand News internal sources provided evidence that the ATF had been employing third-party contractors with high-speed scanners to digitize these records, perform optical character recognition, OCR, on them, and transform the documents into a searchable database. In other words, the ATF has or is in the process of creating a searchable registry of all firearms sold through now defunct gun dealers. All right, so now we're going to move on to what's going on right now and how this letter just surfaced. Now comes a story from Free Beacon, and this is November 6, 2021. And it talks about a document that was obtained exclusively to the Free Beacon from Gun Owners of America. And it says the ATF in fiscal year 2021 processed 54.7 million out of business records, according to an internal document. And it says when a licensed store goes out of business, which we talked about earlier, they have to give the records, and they're stored in a warehouse facility in West Virginia. Now, it says the ATF obtained 53.8 million paper records and another 887,000 electronic records. Now, that was just in 2021 alone. That was an alarming number that was reported nationally and got the concern of some people, including some members of Congress, especially Representative Cloud. Now, it goes on to also talk about how the Biden administration is actually furthering this to get more records, and that currently gun shops can destroy their records after 20 years. This is at the time of this writing, thereby preventing the ATF from accessing information in the future. Okay, well, they want to get rid of the 20-year thing. So it goes on to saying, instead of maintaining the right of licensed firearms dealers to destroy firearms transaction records after 20 years, buried within Biden's proposed regulations is a provision that would mean every single firearms transfer record going forward would eventually be sent to ATF's registry in West Virginia. So basically, it used to be, well, when they went out of business, they had to transfer them to another dealer location, like we talked about earlier with Walmart, or they'd have to send them to the ATF. However, if they were to stay in business for 20 years or longer, the FFL could destroy those records because it'd be just too much burden, presumably, to hold on to them longer than that. Nope. Now they're saying with these new rules or proposals from the Biden administration, nope, all of them need turned over. You can't destroy them after 20 years, which would now lead to where we're at now, where they're going to end up with all of the records, scanning them into OCR, which is a searchable database. Well, this led us to where we started the video. I started off with a letter that was in response to Representative Cloud, and now I'm going to go over briefly the letter that he and his colleagues signed off on, that they wrote to the ATF inquiring about this. And in my opinion, they were suspicious also that they're forming a national registry, which currently violates federal law. Just a couple weeks after this was reported by Free Beacon, this letter was penned by Representative Cloud and signed by 51 fellow congressmen in support, signing off on the letter. And he wrote at that time to Acting Director Richardson. Dear Acting Director Richardson, Congress enacted a prohibition on the creation of a federal gun registry that could allow the government to target American citizens who own guns. We are concerned that this administration is leveraging its power in a way to establish a federal gun registry. Moreover, we are opposed to a recent proposed regulation that would require FFLs to facilitate the creation of a federal gun registry. According to recently published documents, the ATF has collected 54.7 million records in fiscal year 2021 alone. It is an outrage that the federal government would maintain such extensive records of law-abiding citizens, law-abiding firearms transfers. And I would pause to note, the number ended up being almost 1 billion by the time they got this response. But this is crazy. And I like this letter that the congressman wrote. Indeed, current regulations require FFLs to send firearms transaction records to the ATF when an FFL goes out of business. However, Congress has also made it clear in the Firearms Owners Protection Act that the federal government shall not create a federal gun registry and has prohibited ATF from creating any centralized databases with its funding. For decades, FFLs have only been required to maintain firearms transaction records for 20 years, after which they can be destroyed. Many gun owners value the privacy afforded by the destruction of these records of their law-abiding firearms transfers after this period. However, the administration's proposed rulemaking, ATF 2021R-5, would require FFLs to preserve all firearms transactions records. And I would note, that's the same one we were talking about earlier that's tied in with frames and receivers. So they had kind of slipped that into that one. And we have to watch this stuff because they're known to do that. It says this means that 100% of all lawful commercial firearm transfers would eventually end up in an ATF computer system, thereby creating a permanent database. This gives us serious cause for concern that the Biden administration is intent on creating a federal gun registry by circumventing the legal process. In fact, a GAO report from 2016 was titled, "ATF did not always comply with the Appropriations Act restriction and should better adhere to its policies." With that in mind, we have several questions for which we would like written responses. How many records does the ATF Out of Business Records Center, OOB, have in total? How many of these records have been processed into a digitalized format? How many firearms traces using these records were essential to the successful prosecution of a violent criminal in the last 3 years? In the case of each successful prosecution of a violent criminal, in what year was the essential firearms transfer record completed? 18 U.S. Code 926 prohibits, quote, any system of registration of firearms, firearms owners, or firearms transactions or dispositions from being established. Explain in detail how the Out of Business Records Center policy combined with the proposed rule change in ATF 2021R-05 does not violate the statutory restriction on a federal gun or gun owner registry. It is critical that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives does not use its power to encroach on the privacy of gun owners and restrict their Second Amendment rights. Please provide a written response to the questions above no later than December 31st, 2021. God bless. And that's how that letter's written. And there's notable congressmen that signed this, links down in the description. Such as Lauren Boebert of Colorado, Andy Biggs of Arizona, Madison Cawthorn of North Carolina, Ronnie Jackson of Texas, Jim Jordan of Ohio, Elise Stefanik of New York, and Matt Gaetz of Florida, and others also signed on Representative Cloud's letter of inquiry. Well, that kind of brings us back full circle here. They responded back, in my opinion, in a game of semantics, word game, saying, no, we're completely abiding by the Firearms Owners Protection Act, and the sole purpose is to trace firearms that are used in crimes, and we're just doing the American people a favor and providing to their safety. That's how I'm interpreting the ATF's response. 920,664,765 out of business records as of November 2021. I would note that's not going to count privately made firearms. Some of these documents don't necessarily represent a unique firearm. I understand that. But what about all the records that are sitting in gun shops right now that are on pieces of paper, the old-fashioned way, that haven't gone out of business that they don't have? In my opinion, there could be 1 billion firearms in the United States, which that is actually encouraging. That's a number that you don't really hear floated around. I think there's many more firearms, according to this, in the United States than most of the statistics that are often cited. Now, that's good news. The bad news is, I ain't buying it. I believe, as well as the congressman that wrote the letter and his colleagues who signed it, this is highly suspect that they could be making a registry of searchable files from these firearms transaction records, as well as other documents and records that are required to be turned over by out-of-business FFLs. And this new proposed rule if that's finalized, which from what I understand, it's going to be rather soon, that can make it where there is no destroying of them after 20 years, as there has been for decades, as noted in the letter. Let me know what you guys think. I know this video was a little long, but some of you like the longer videos to listen to, kind of like a podcast while you're driving to work. But there's some astonishing numbers here, and there's a lot of information to dive into, and I just didn't want to do a drive-by and just throw the numbers out there and not explain the context of what's really going on. Now, some of the things here are just my opinion, obviously, but a lot of the writing's on the wall, right? And I do have the supporting documents and articles down in the description, and I'm going to roll into images of this recent letter that I just obtained via the GOA from Representative Cloud, and leave the links to all the other stuff, and just let me know what you guys think, because, wow, I think they probably have a registry right now, even though they're specifically prohibited from having it by an act of Congress, and Congress makes laws. That's literally what the Constitution says. So thank you to Representative Cloud. I doubt he'll watch this video, but if you do, thank you. Thank you to all of your colleagues who signed this letter. And thank you to the GOA who's been involved in all of this stuff all along and providing these documents to me so I can pass it on to all of my viewers, which are very important. And this is going to be up to the American people to decide if we approve of this or not. And I hope that you don't approve. All right, guys, thanks for watching and have a good one.